Hey everybody, I'm Reggie Williams, founder and CEO of Ambrosia for Heads, and with me I have Jake Payne. And today, hip hop is in a lot of pain. We lost one of our greats. DMX passed away at the age of 50. Um, Today, we're not going to retread the details of his death. We are not going to, talk about the salacious stuff. Today is going to be a celebration of the man born Earl Simmons, later becoming DMX, Darkman X. Today we are going to do our best to lift up this legend and let hip hop celebrate the man, the myth, the immortal DMX. How you doing, man? I know it's been a heavy week for both of us.
Yeah, what a wild ride. I feel good. I really appreciated that intro. That felt like an invocation, which is that's the right thing to do for Earl Simmons, Dark Man X.
Yeah. We got a chance to see him together, you and I, back in 2016 at the Roots picnic. It was crazy because he at that time was, I believe, 46 or so,
Hmm.
and he was running around the stage like hyperkinetic. He was on the speakers performing. It was wild. What was your recollection of that day?
Yeah, I mean that was a comeback campaign for X. I mean, and look no further than the live show. Look no further than the stage. And I think you and I both going into it didn't know the kind of performer we would get. It's a Roots picnic, and for anyone that's been, usually that's kind of like a hometown thing. Like a lot of Soulquarian performers there, and a lot of artists that are on the come up that Quest and the Roots kind of night. And then there's some legacy acts, and X, that was one of the highlights of that day. And it was early in the day, the sun was still up, and he tore that stage down. You and I were both really impressed. I think we shot some video of it too
Yeah, we
for
did.
whatever it was at the time, Facebook, the gram, Twitter, who knows.
Yeah, some of our bootleg stuff on YouTube back in the day, some iPhone, special.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
but
so
oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead, go ahead.
No, but there's and it's funny, over really the last 10 days, once X went into the hospital, I've just been, preparing a lot of thoughts, and I have this memory that's near and dear to me of that day is, moments after the performance, you and I got backstage, and everyone's kind of milling, doing the networking, card passing thing. I mean, no one has business cards like that anymore. And X and his entourage rolled through, and you know, I mean, I think we've all watched, 20 years of how DMX moves. And, you hear stories of Naughty by Nature and MC Hammer of like these hip hop legends that move with a crowd. And X was very much like that. And I think he had a lot of the Rough Rider, entourage with him. And everyone was kind of, and I've heard several people describe this whenever X would go into label buildings or concerts. It's like the parting of the seas. Everybody gives that man room because he moves with such intent and intensity. And Reggie Williams, man, you walked right up to the parting of the seas and extended your hand and like ran up on him and gave him a dap and said a few things in his ear because the two of you had some prior acquaintanceship, friendship, whatever. And he stopped what he was doing and you guys had a brief moment and everyone kind of looked on because I think everyone wasn't so quick to do what you did. And I thought that was a really cool testament because also what I know now is you weren't there trying to get a flick with X or do anything like that. You just wanted to affirm him at a really important part of his life and career.
Yeah, man. It's funny you say that because I had only had one interaction with him before that. It was 2012. It was the taping of the BET Hip Hop Awards ciphers. He did a cipher with Murder Mook, Eve, and Cassidy. I just went back and watched it yesterday, and I was there, seeing it unfold real time, and it was crazy. They all just like destroyed it, but I had a vivid recollection of DMX. So I was about to go downstairs because I think the place was like an abandoned warehouse and it had a couple of floors and there was like an elevator and we shot them in an alley and it was dark but like lit and everything. It was really like a really cool setup. And I was about to go to the elevator. The doors open and it's like a movie where like it's slow motion and they part and all of a sudden you see X and same thing like him and like three or four other people And he was like 5'11" or so, almost 6 feet, but he had truly kind of like a bigger than life kind of aura about him. There was an energy that I'd been around tons and tons of famous people at that point, but a few people where I was like, I felt kind of intimidated, and so I never got to actually touch his energy, and for
Hmm.
me, it's very important in those situations to really touch a person's energy. There's something, and we miss this now, but like there's something you get from like human contact, something like you transfer energy, I think. And I regretted that. I regretted not talking to him that day and saying what's up because he's been such an important artist in my life. And so yeah, that day in Philly when we had the opportunity, I was not going to miss it. I think I told you I've always wanted to rep for AFH more than anything. It's not about any kind of personal glory or fandom or anything like that. I respect people, but I also want people to know how much we celebrate them. And there have been a few artists we've celebrated more at AFH. So it was really great to be able to do that. And when things like this happen, like I think sometimes we get in a place where you and I we have access to people, we take these things for granted. Like I'll see this person this time, I'll do it next time or whatever, and this shows you can't take those for granted, man. You can't take it for granted. So I'm glad that I was able to touch his energy.
Yeah, that's very true. I got to see X perform more recently in 2019 at Soundset in Minneapolis. And I went, on behalf of AFH. You had something going on that weekend, and it was great just to be there and see what the Rhyme Sayers had built out there. And X was one of the headliners along with Lil Wayne and some others. And after the festival, at the luxury hotel in town, um, it was wild because in the bar, there were the talent, the artists getting drinks, and then over to the side was the media. And there's an overlapping respect there. And you hear stories like this in sports where, sports writers would be sitting side by side with the athletes. But there's also, of great writers, I find, an understanding of distance. And, Just Blaze was there, and X came through. And it was funny because it was the Twin Cities, and X wore that entire day a Randy Moss Vikings jersey, which I thought was so dope. This is a throwback. It's a testament to the era that he made famous, and he showed love to Minneapolis. Another incredible, I mean, to me, that was the best performance that weekend. And I was kicking it with a lot of friends of ours, a lot of folks in the media, and I got up to use the restroom. And there's this long hallway at the W Hotel, and it was me, and then it was X. And he had such a great day, and it was one of those moments too where I didn't want to interrupt him, and I also think that that's kind of weird, when folks are coming out of a restroom or something to, go slap hands or something. So I did something I've never done for anyone else. We're in the hallway, and right as I got to pass him, I saluted him. And that's not like, I'm not a saluter. Yeah. And he stopped and he looked at me and he saluted me right back. And we kept it moving. And I think of that day often because I was like, that's just a testament to who this guy was. And I'm glad I didn't run up on him like, hey, let's get a photo or, all that stuff. And yeah, I've thought of that day a lot over the last 2 years, but especially over the last 10 days.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. So we did, one of our most recent podcasts was celebrating the year 2000 and what that meant for hip hop. And I know that that was a sweet spot year for you. That was a real core year, in part of your development as a human being. And, X really broke in 1998. He had a couple things before that. But so, what was his music like for you, real time when it first came out? Like what was set the stage? What was your life like and how did it impact you?
Yeah, I mean, 1998, I was, I'm doing my math. I was 13 years old. So like, and hip hop rolled my life, and you and I talk a lot about that of like, there's certain points in life where the music that's prevalent then means the most to you. And I'll be real with you, I was a diehard Tupac fan. And when Tupac passed, I think we were all very guarded of that legacy. And to watch X come in, we'll talk about that over the course of today's episode. I mean, there were some early comparisons made, and I feel like, but none of that was by X's design. So I wasn't resistant, but I was somewhere around skeptical, and then instantly the music, I think of Get At Me Dog and Ruff Ryders Anthem and the stuff on It's Dark and Hell Is Hot. And within a month of that dropping, I owned the album. And when Flesh of My Flesh dropped 7 months later, that was a release date purchase. So X, at a time in my life, just embodied a new type of rap star, and somebody that you could feel if you watched MTV The Diary and those different programs where you would get to know an artist. Everything about this guy was palpable and heartfelt. But that was me. I mean, I was an adolescent and just looking up to MCs and hip hop heroes. For you, you were a man at that point. So what do you remember of '98?
Yeah, it was a really, I have a very specific recollection. The first time I heard about him was a good friend of mine. I always wanted to be a DJ when I grew up. Like, I still want to be a DJ when I grow up. And a good friend of mine gave me the opportunity to actually spin, in front of people for the first time in my life. He said, "Yo, my sister's having a party. We need a DJ. I think you could do it. Are you down?" I was like, "Yeah, cool." And so I'm getting my playlist ready, and he was like, "Yo, you got to play this song, Get At Me, Dog." And I'm like, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, DMX, you ever heard that yet?" And I was like, "Nah." And so I went to Tower Records on 4th and Broadway. I get the CD single, I play it in, and like I hear that beat, and it sounds like Eric Sermon. And it's like it's like a great song. And so then when the album came out, it represented for me a stage of life where it was the last bit of my adulthood before becoming a parent. So it was like that freedom, that New York, that going to Nels and like being in the clubs and like really soaking up what it was to be in a hip hop scene in New York in its heyday for hip hop. So DMX represented the pinnacle of that. It was just after the Bad Boy era when you saw a new wave of stars coming in. Like Jay was starting to come into his own, and DMX just exploded and took over and was bigger than everyone. So that was my memory, man.
Yeah, I feel that, and I look back again too, and when you're 13, when you're even just any teen, like, you don't have money, you may or may not be dealing with intimate relationships, but what X rapped about was palpable. It didn't matter if you were 30 or you were 12. And one of the things I love in hip hop is that kind of put your shoulders back, stand tall, throw down for yourself. And I think that X embodied that really well. And I at the time, I remember sports, and I remember just kind of like boy versus world, man versus world, and X was a great soundtrack to that. And that carried on, even the music that X made in the last decade still embodied that. And then we can talk about how when you're conflicted, you're dealing with things, he also made incredibly deep, vulnerable music that also allowed anyone to unpack who they really are, what they're going through. And you can't say that about all the artists on X's level, and certainly in the widespread genre of music. So to see him do that on the highest level, that meant so much to me. I'm glad that I lived in a time when DMX was a hip hop superstar.
Yeah, yeah. So we've done a lot. Obviously we've followed this man's career and life for really since its inception, so for 20 plus years now. But you and I have done a lot of studying of his, being very intentional over the last few days, weeks, really looking at him as a man. And so I want us to talk today about some of the things that defined Earl Simmons the man. His childhood. There's a lot out there about his childhood, but in watching a bunch of interviews and hearing him talk about it himself, I've learned so much. He had an asthma; it's well documented, but it was to the extent where he had to actually go to the hospital multiple times, sometimes several times a week, because he was literally at the point where he couldn't breathe and was in jeopardy of potentially dying. And so he said on one of the interviews, I think it was People's Party with Talib Kweli, that he always wanted to be a fireman when he was growing up, because they lived on the 11th floor of a project in Yonkers, and he wanted to, when he had these asthma attacks, the elevators were often broken, as they were in buildings like that. And the firemen would walk up 11 flights of stairs to get him and carry him down and take him to the hospital. So they were true heroes to him, and that's what he wanted to do when he grew up, was to give someone that kind of feeling of security and safety. He ultimately wasn't able to do it because of the asthma, but they were the first kind of heroes for him. Obviously he went through a lot of physical abuse, and we don't need to get into that because, again, we're going to keep it like super positive today, but it did play a huge role in developing who he was as a person, the content in his music, the effects of why he started to, use, substances, things like that. So, we can't ignore it, but, I don't want to dwell on it too much. But one of the things that happened for him is when he was a young kid, not even quite a teenager, he left home. He had stolen a dog, and he brought the dog home. And his mom was like, "Yo, what is this? What is this dog? What are you doing with this dog?" And rather than get rid of the dog like his mom wanted him to, he decided he was going to leave and take the dog with him. And so he spent the night on a rooftop taking care of the dog. He took two hot dogs out of the freezer, one for him and one for the dog. And the dog didn't know him. He didn't know the dog's name or anything like that. And they fell asleep together on the rooftop. And then that next day, he hears the dog growling at someone, and the dog is like some guy is like, "Yo, we need to do some maintenance over here." And he's like, "Go ahead." And he's like, "Yo, but can you get your dog?" Because the
Yeah.
dog was trying to get at the guy, right? And so he learned that day that get taking care of someone like that, and being willing to give them half of what you have is something, a kind of bond that human beings can have with dogs that often they can't have with each other. And he says that dogs are what allowed him to learn how to become someone's friend.
Yeah.
He said one of the deepest things that I heard is that only God and a dog can have unconditional love. And he didn't think it was a coincidence that they were the same word flipped, backwards and forwards. So, what did you think about his connection with dogs and
I mean, that was one of the things I liked from an early age of X. I mean, in some of the early artwork with It's Dark and Hell is Hot, he's got a tattoo on his back that says Boomer. And, people may remember that was an ad lib of X's with everything else. People remember the growls and the barks, but dogs meant so much to him that he made, millions of fans know about this dog that had an impact to him. And I laugh and you and I make fun. I mean, I think on a recent episode we could hear your dog barking, and mine regularly makes cameos like Jim Carrey in the Living Color sketch. Like, so you and I are both dog lovers, and I'm a person that definitely has faith in something greater than myself. And so X carrying those things with him into his music long before he articulated it the way that you just described, which I think was, he said it at other points, but he really made that, he drove that point home with Talib Kweli. It's just a testament to how much I could relate or feel this guy. And yeah, especially when you're dealing with abuse of any kind, unconditional love means, so much. And that he
yeah.
got it, it's powerful.
And he talked about using the dogs in other circumstances too. One time he said a dog got him out of police tickets on more than one occasion, because talked about how cops that get out of the car, they they straighten up their cap and, tighten up the waistline and walk to you with authority.
Yeah.
And he said his dog just went crazy on this guy, and the guy was like, oh,
Yeah.
like stepped back real quick, and he's like, yeah, okay, just slow down, man, just slow down, like it's cool, just slow down. It's like,
Yeah.
cool. And then he said he also used to rob people with his dogs, and he talked about how he would, leave the dog, on one person and then go and rob another person and come back to the other person. And he said the dude would be crying and and say, can you just get the dog? But he had a really special connection with dogs, man. And obviously it's something that followed him into his career, with the growling and, his first single. Um, I talked about substances a little bit. One of the things he said also is that the first person who got him to rap, the person who his name was Reddy Ron, who got him to actually think about rapping for a career, is actually the first person who also got him to try crack. And he did it unbeknownst to him. He laced a blunt, passed it around, and you know,
14 years old.
14 years old, and it was like a mortal wound for DMX. He said that, this is a person he had trusted so much and looked up to, and why would someone that you cared so much about do that for you? And it's something that, like, haunted him, throughout his career, throughout his life. But he says the drugs were a symptom of something bigger. It wasn't just the drugs; it was really, tied back to the abuse. So, um, you know, I want to actually shift though into like his career.
Hmm.
He started at 14, but I know you did some work on this. So what can you say about his early career?
It's interesting. Yeah, I think you just mentioned it, but X's journey into hip hop begins as a beatboxer, which is in many ways a lost art form. But in the early '80s, very much there thanks to Dougie Fresh and the Fat Boys and others. And it's his name, which I remember when X popped on the scene. It was one of those names that you know felt familiar. And there was Davey DMX before, which '80s Def Jam rapper, but the name DMX comes from the Oberheim drum machine, which they said with X beatboxing he could be just as good as the drum machine, which I think is so interesting. And even though 1998 was a year that we got further and further away, I think, from hip hop's origins, just with the budgets of videos and so many things, X carried the genesis of the culture with him. And even I'm not very familiar with Yonkers, you might be, but even coming from a place like that, that was kind of a forgotten territory on the hip hop map or on the rap map. It's just so interesting to me to kind of bring those roots. And just like 50 Cent, just like Eminem, so many of the hip hop superstars, 1997, 98 might be when DMX blew up, but that was damn near a decade after his career, as we can document it, really started, which is again a testament to his tenacity and persistence and perseverance. We often as a culture talk a lot about the great unsigned hype columns of the source. You have Common, you have Biggie, you have so on and so forth. But DMX in '91, I believe it was the January issue, got into the Source magazine, which is again a testament to both of those things. Like, he clearly stood out with his talent, but also, the early regime of the Mind Squad, knew enough to cover this guy who was coming from what Yonkers, which I think is so interesting. And, another key incubator for so many legends is we talk about on this podcast a lot, Stretch Armstrong and Bobito's, show at Columbia. And DMX was on there, and he didn't, he came on with Percy P, which diehard hip hop fans might know by virtue of, doing stuff with Madlib and Lord Finesse and all of that. But Percy P in the early '90s brings X with him, and that's documented. Like, and this was, like I said, 5+ years before he ever gets, to Def Jam, before we ever know his name. And I love that, again, because there's overnight success stories in hip hop, and that happens. But much like what he embodied in his content, X took the slow path, and I'm sure there were many opportunities for him to, hang up and leave it all behind, but he didn't.
Yeah, man. It's testament to the grind. Like, you and I know better than most that all these guys who become superstars kind of overnight really had 7 years of grind before that, and you can see it now because it's more of a digital footprint with mixtapes and, like, Bandcamp releases and things like that. But with people like X, it was those appearances on Columbia's radio station with Bob and Stretch It Was, mixtape appearances. You know, he got a great break, and I think was it '97 with LL Cool J, appearing on 4 3 2 1
Yeah.
with LL, Canibus, Method Man, and Redman too, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that is such a major look for an unsigned artist to get on a track like that, you know. And you know, a lot of the coverage of that track has been about the beef between LL and Canibus. And I just listened to it again yesterday and like, wow,
Yeah.
did LL go with the dude? And like, it is so insane that
Yeah.
like to go with a guy on a song that you invited him on. So rightfully so, a lot of the chatter was about that. But you know, you had some feelings about X's verse on there. What did you think of his verse?
You know, I've seen it a lot on the timeline. I mean, he stole the show, and in history, we spend a lot of time because you know it was a major crossroads for Canibus and LL Cool J. You know, it had all these histories, but just bars. X used that moment to the fullest, and it's important too. You know, that's not his first appearance. You know, yes, there was the Percy P freestyle. He put out his first solo record in 92, 93. So Ruff Ryders exists back then. X self-releases this joint called Born Loser, which, you know, kind of comes in the middle of the horrorcore scene of, you know, Gravediggers, early Onyx, Flatliners, you know, that like, woe is me hip hop. And we've seen a lot of the great MCs participate in that. You know, X puts out this joint and it eventually gets picked up by Rough House Columbia, which is a label, you know, famous for what it did with, you know, the Fugees and Lauryn Hill and Crisscross and Cypress Hill. But sort of like Tommy Boy, Rough House is one of these labels that would give out singles deals and just see if it stuck. And X was one of those artists. And, you know, on Drink Champs, I think the first time he appeared in 2016, he called the deal, you know, a tax write-off. Which when you go back and look at the record, there's no video. Born Loser, I mean, is that song going to be the joint that defines an artist? Probably not. But you can hear the rest of X's career, like the disappointment of like, yo, I think it's going to happen. No, it's not going to happen. So he goes right back to Ruff Ryders and puts a series of, you know, just joints out. And he's working with Mike Geronimo, which I don't feel like is talked about enough. You know, he appears on Time to Build in 1995, you know, which would go on to be like this look back before they were stars then moment. And Irv Gotti's at the center of it. X works with Pudgy the Fat Bastard. Again, no one talks about it. And Pudgy was very instrumental in kind of Ready to Die Biggie too. But he's just kind of making his inroads. And you look and you can hear the evolution. And it's funny too, it's worth noting, the same way we talk about Jay-Z, you know, in the Jazzo to original flavor sort of days with the Jiggity J, you know, like the stutter step style. X came in with a spelling style. And, you know, as far as he says, in 1988, he was locked up with K Solo, who went on to become, you know, one of the signed artists and, you know, kind of had a moment with the Hit Squad out of Long Island. And, you know, K Solo, one of his biggest records was The Letterman. And when he released it, X was still, you know, in and out of the system. And X resented the fact that K took his style. And it's so interesting too, because you look years later as X becomes a star, I feel like there's some subtleties that issue stayed with him of like, yo, that should be me. So that resentment, that inferiority complex builds in X to when he finally has this breakthrough point, like we're talking about with LL. It was like, man, I'm gonna use this moment and I'm gonna just smash it. And you know, again, we hear that story with 50 Cent, with Eminem, with, you know, so many of the artists that have had, you know, a mortal impact on this culture.
Yeah, man. You know, there are a few examples of it. You mentioned it. You know, 50, you know, having been signed to Sony first with How to Rob, and then, you know, gets dropped and gets shot, and then comes back as a major superstar. You know, Jay was signed to Payday, and you know, put out his single "In My Lifetime," and you know that doesn't make noise. He gets dropped and comes back, starts his own, and then, you know, signs with Def Jam. He and X had a lot of parallels. And that's not common. Typically, you get signed, you're one and done. Like that, it's a wrap. It's clear the public didn't want you, and that's what it is. So it shows the perseverance and the grit that he had to kind of fight his way back from that and come back and redefine himself. He and Jay had that kind of parallel, and their careers, they had a back and forth, which we'll get into in a bit. But they had a lot of connection, not only in terms of like tracks that they were on, but also just the way that their careers kind of like evolved over time.
Yeah.
One of those, the big one, is that Def Jam was a huge part of both of their careers. So X, back in 1997, he has this breakthrough moment with LL. Obviously, LL has a connection with Lyor Cohen. The two of them have been, very tight over the years. And so I'm guessing that, he was on Lyor's radar, and Lyor is now like the head of Def Jam. So he goes X to audition, and it's like 4 or 5 other people. X had been jumped a few days before. He had been accused of robbing someone, and ironically, this is a robbery that he didn't do. He says that he had actually robbed the guy who robbed these other guys. And because of that, he had their stuff. And, so they find their stuff with him. And so they assume that he did the robbery, and they jump him and they break his jaw. He's got this audition, and rather than skip the audition, he actually goes and raps with his jaw wired shut. So before Kanye Through the Wire, X like raps Through the Wire and actually compels Lyor enough to sign him to Def Jam, which is just crazy. But just that's such a DMX story, what I mean? And then but before that, he had gone to Bad Boy, because Puff at that time, this is like No Way Out, like Biggs just passed, but Bad Boy with Mason, it's just really like blowing up. And so Puff said he respected Puffy more than almost any executive. He's been very outspoken about the industry. He said that Def Jam, like the top 3 executives, like had lie in their name, and he's been very cynical about the music industry. But he respected Puff because Puff said, I'm not going to sign you. You're not marketable. Your voice is too rough. Said it to his face. And, a few weeks later, after doing that audition for Def Jam, he gets the Def Jam deal. And then Puff comes back and says, yo, what do they offer you? I'll double it. And he's like, nah, I'm good, man. Like, you made the decision, but, I still respect it. But, what do you think about that? Like, what do you think X would have been like on Bad Boy? You think he would have tried to like, do what he did with like Mason and flip him to something more polished, or you think he would have let him go?
I mean, I think you get a kind of an answer to that with the Lox's first album, which was another breakout point for X. Money, Power, Respect became his highest charting song ever, which something, again, we're going to talk about. But, and there's people that love that Lox album. For me, I always liked when they got a chance kind of to be more themselves outside of Puff's impact. I think it worked out really well. And one thing I want to add to what you said is Irv Gotti. I think that Irv's impact on X and his being a conduit is huge. And just to talk about Irv for a second, for years was known as DJ Irv, some of those production credits. And when X was self-releasing this music, these 12-inch singles, they were produced by a guy named Chad Elliott, and happened to be Irv Gotti's roommate at the time. And Irv was this DJ just hungry to kind of get his break in the industry. And Chad linked him with X. And, I know that Irv has become a polarizing figure because he's become his own kind of star personality. But I think that he was a really great producer, especially in the mid to late 90s. And we see that with what he did with Jay-Z, but, really helped kind of groom X's sound. That joint with Mike Geronimo, Time to Build, is an Irv production, and Mike was one of Irv's artists who didn't get his shine. And a lot of that, I think, had to do with label politics. So X then became an opportunity for Irv to leverage his way in the industry. And he became one of the top A&Rs at Def Jam by virtue of bringing this guy in. So I think that somewhere between Lior and X, you have Irv, and I think that that's really huge. And the other thing I want to add too is, and I've heard X talk about it, you know, about the Tupac thing. He says he had a chance to meet Pac, and the reason he met Pac was because Dre and Suge, at some point, I have to imagine somewhere around 95, maybe early 96, brought X out to LA just to consider him for Death Row. And that's wild to think of, and that ultimately didn't work out. And they later did the same thing with the Locks. But in the end, I mean, Def Jam was the perfect place for DMX. And you think about it, X has a lot in common with Method Man, not in their deliveries, but in their content. They're both classically trained MCs who rap about everyday stuff with a grimy persona. That makes sense. And that also applies to Redman. And then, like you said, his journey is a lot like Jay's. So by the time you get to 97, 98 Def Jam, although he, was an unlikely star based on what the last 6 years of his life had looked like, it just made sense. And the fact that you have Irv there and Lior and Kevin Liles and this team that is desperately looking for talent to take it into the new millennium, it was lightning in a bottle.
Yeah, so it's 1997, 98. Jay has released Reasonable Doubt independently. Affiliates with Def Jam for the next album is starting to thrive. Method Man and Redman are starting to thrive. Ja Rule is right around the corner. And then you have DMX, coming in 1998 with these two albums. It's Dark and Hell is Hot and Flesh of My Flesh and Blood of My Blood within the same year. At a time when, nowadays that's commonplace, right? Like Griselda will put out an album seeming like once a month.
Yeah.
Currency started that, and so many artists, really just put out as much material as possible in a given year. But back then, it was very methodical. You put out one album per year, usually not more than that and not less than that, because less than that, like one every 2 years or whatever, you fell off the radar and you weren't on people's map anymore. So it was one album per year. You led with like a single before the album. You had 2 or 3 more singles once the album came out. You had your videos. Like it was all like very routine. So for him to release 2 albums in a year was very, very atypical. But to do so at the kind of success that he had and have both be number one, both go platinum within like a couple of weeks, was absolutely insane. And there's a reason for that. Why did they do that?
It turned into a bet. So 98 is really, and you just mentioned it, it became this comeback year for Def Jam. Number one albums from Foxy Brown, Method Man, Jay-Z, and X twice. And, after the first one, It's Dark and Hell is Hot. Unlike those other artists, X is the newest act of that handful. So to have it come out, do number one, even though it's not reflected on the Billboard charts, Get At Me Dog, How's It Going Down, Ruff Ryders Anthem, to have songs explode in the streets, strike twice. So as I understand it, Lior Cohen made $1 million offer to X on top of whatever else was in the agreement. If you can give me an album in the next 30 days, I will give you $1 million on top of everything else. And, as a guy that, spent a lot of his youth and early 20s as a stick-up kid, as a guy who grew up without much, you make me that offer at a time when I feel very confident in my skills, I'm going to do it. And X did it. And Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood became, it bookended the year. And it's crazy too, because the sales of that album first week were almost 3 times It's Dark and Hell is Hot. So the world was ready for it. And I think we can agree that both of those albums, I don't know which one is better of the two. I personally lean It's Dark and Hell is Hot because that was the entry point, but those albums hold up very well in time.
Yeah, in retrospect, we now know that putting out an album in 30 days was light work for DMX.
Yeah.
I saw a Breakfast Club interview he did where he said that he wrote and recorded 7 songs in a day one time. So this guy, just go back to the Tupac comparison. People, thought because of the look and like the ability to talk about like really sensitive emotions on record, and also turn it up and like have the party going that he and Pop were like. But the work ethic may have been the thing that was most similar between the two of them. So to do that in 30 days was nothing. I suspect that the reason why they did it is because fourth quarter means so much to record companies. That's the reason why they have so many releases around. Back in the day, it was around Christmas time because when people actually bought music,
Yeah.
that was the time when they would buy it, and so they would try and put as much stuff in the fourth quarter as possible. And given the success he had at the beginning of the year, I'm sure they're like, "Yeah, we got to capitalize on this." But another interesting story on top of the bed is that Chris Lighty, who was a top executive at Def Jam at the time, and this comes from a story that she wrote on AFH. It was based on a Mogul episode that was done by Reggie Osei about Chris Lighty. And so, first of all, it's crazy to think that all three of those people are gone now.
Yeah.
Reggie, Chris, and now D as well. But Reggie tells a story that one of the rumors that got out about Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood is that Dave Lighty, Chris's brother, had said that he thought that X's first album was cool, but his mixtape was better. And so that gets back to DMX, and he hears that Lighty said that his first album was trash, basically. It's a game of telephone, and now it's gotten embellished. And so now, like, Chris Lighty instead of Dave Lighty is like completely like, just killing like X's first album. And so X gets mad about that. And he decides he's going to handle it because X is a dude who's like, we're men, we settle it. So he's in the Def Jam office one day. He sees Chris Lighty, and the story is he sucker punched him, hit him right in the face, knocked out Lighty's tooth, right? And Chris Lighty, like, he was an executive, right? He grew into an executive, but he was one of the original Violators. And Violator was not just like a music crew. They were like almost basically like a gang, and so Lighty is like ready to like handle it. Like he goes and he gets like his original crew, and he's about to go find X and like, and lump him up. And Leo's like, yo, I can't have this. I can have one of my top executives like taking out one of my top artists that can't go down. And so Leo, settled it by having Chris, get a piece of the royalties from X's second album. And so I think you came up with the headline that like it's something about blood money, like he had to pay with blood money. So
yeah,
but that's just one of the crazy stories about DMX, but so he's humming, and talk about what that meant for Def Jam, for him to like have the kind of year that he did.
Well, I mean, it was a year that in retrospect, Def Jam, changed hands. Russell, in large part stepped away from the company. I think he remained on the board, Russell Simmons, but they made a sale to UMG. And you talk about the fourth quarter numbers. Throughout 98, Def Jam found a way to, go to the front of the class. I mean, you certainly, and you and I have spoken about it on this pod before, of like what No Limit was doing on an independent level. But at the top of the mainstream consciousness, you had Bad Boy, Rockefeller's bubbling up, but Def Jam, and Def Jam was tied into everything. They were tied into X, they were tied into Rock, tied into Method Man and Wu-Tang. I mean, it was just a huge, huge year. And what's so interesting about X is, he comes in and he has an alliance with Jay-Z that goes back to the 90s, and he's got the Locks, which by 98 are, stars in their own right, especially, in New York and in the East Coast. But X comes in and his production squad is relative no names. I mean, that became Swizz Beatz, that became Dame Grease, that became, a host of people. And throughout X's career, I mean, he would go on and later work with people like Just Blaze and Kanye West and No ID, but his albums are just people that he believed in. And I think that is truly remarkable because, so often, especially at a major label in the 90s, I mean, we're 4 years past Illmatic, who's producing you matters. And X, you know, you mentioned 4321, that's an Eric Sermon production. So you would think that he would come in with, you know, these really trusted hands. And instead, I mean, the Ruff Ryders, you know, the Dean family, they have a nephew, this guy Swizz Beatz, who's damn near a teenager at the time, and has a sound unlike anything we've ever heard before. So to him to come in with a joint like Ruff Ryders Anthem, and you know, and Swizz, this teenager, convinces X that the song works, and we all know in retrospect what that joint accomplishes. But X is listening to the people around him. He's taking big chances, and he's just trusting the collective intuition, which I think is just insane. Because even just pound for pound, same year, you look at Volume 2, and that's such a sure-handed album. Jay grabs all of these different guests, all of these great producers. He comes with a product that I think appeases a little bit of everybody in the, you know, national kind of rap map. And X does the exact opposite and just makes the kind of album he probably would have made anyway, and does it twice with It's Dark and Flesh.
Yeah, you talk about Ruff Ryders Anthem. You know, that is arguably DMX's biggest song, if not it's top 3 for sure.
Yeah.
And it establishes the crew. But DMX didn't want to do the song.
Yeah.
You know, he thought it was too simplistic. Like, you know, he thought it was just too nursery rhyme. Like, you know, he was a lyricist, he was a spitter. But he actually did that because he lost a bet too. He was playing a game of casino, as the story goes, and he lost, and as a result, he had to do the song, and it ended up being one of his biggest hits. You know,
and you're being polite too. What X allegedly told Swizz Beatz is that it's some white boy shit, which
is that right?
I can say that's our word. No, and you know it's funny because it makes sense. And I mean, at the time, I'm an early teenager. I'm going to a mixed but a predominantly white school. And that song crossed over, and it was easy because it's like it was very easy to know. But then on the other hand, you had the video, which again, I mean, this is prime shiny suit era rap, and to have, you know, the motorcycles and the four-wheelers in the park and this conviction and authenticity, nobody had seen anything like that. And for anyone making knee-jerk Tupac comparisons at the time, Pac never had videos that looked like that. You know what I mean? Like It was a totally different aesthetic than anything else in hip hop, and it felt incredible, you know?
So going back to Def Jam, you know, so we have Meth and Red and Foxy and Jay, and DMX comes in and does his thing. And what a lot of people don't know is that when companies are sold, they often sell after they have a big year or a big quarter, because the transaction is based on a multiple of the revenue that was generated in that year. And so the biggest score of all time is Clive Calder with Jive. You know, when he sold Jive, the year before he had Britney Spears, like NSYNC, and somebody else gigantic like drop, and he had a put so he could force a sale to BMG at a certain point, and he did it in like 2001 for $2.1 billion, and it was at the apex of the industry, right? Napster had just hit and was about to take everything down, and he got out just in time. So for Def Jam, DMX allowed them to do that, because in addition to those other people, him dropping, this is probably also why they wanted to squeeze it in. And that, now that I think about it, that's probably why they wanted to squeeze it in. And that year, that second album, is because they were thinking about selling, and then they could do it so on a multiple. So it was also kind of the apex year for Def Jam, if not creatively, certainly commercially, you know. So in addition to being an artist, you talk about the relationship he had with Swizz, and like giving him that trust. He also brought a lot to the table with Ruff Ryders. You know, he brought the Locks, he brought Drag On, and he brought Eve to Ruff Ryders. So in a lot of ways, Ruff Ryders, you know, even though people think about it as Swizz Beatz' crew, was DMX's crew just as much, you know. So you know, he really had a tremendous impact behind the scenes in addition to in front of the scenes.
Yeah.
You know, another collective he was involved in was Murder Inc. You want to talk about that and kind of what happened?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we mentioned Irv's name, and Murder Inc. was originally, you know, and so the late 90s, I know we think of the 2000s and the Slaughterhouse era as like the super group renaissance, but there were super groups happening in the late 90s. Tupac, what he tried to do with One Nation. You hear of the Commission with Biggie and Charlie Baltimore and them. But there was Murder Inc., Murder Incorporated, which was X, Jay-Z, and Ja Rule. And again, by virtue of Irv, connected to all three of those artists, they made some incredible songs together. And you look at Murdergram, which is on the Streets is Watching soundtrack, one of my favorite X verses ever. And Ty Fife, who, worked on Rump Shaker with Rex and Effects, produces my favorite beat that he's ever done. And those guys just destroy it. And it's grimy. It's the kind of J that I think we can sometimes forget exists today. It's literally just like murder rap. And then they did it again on Ja Rule's debut album with It's Murder. And also, I believe, Ty Fife. And just some really incredible stuff. And the group was talked about signing as a unit, and it just couldn't get off the ground. And years later, I mean, these three artists would work together in different tandems over points. And Irv Gotti has said that 3 different times he tried to make that album happen. But as we know, between the late 90s and the mid 2000s, supergroups kind of fell out of vogue. And at this point, you have 3 giant egos and 3 guys that have their own companies. And, it just wasn't meant to be. But as we talk about, Big L and Cameron, or just different what ifs in hip hop, Murder Inc. as a trio would have been insane.
Yeah, that's a massive what if, man. So there were a couple things. So first of all, X and Ja Rule kind of had a problem. Ja Rule growled just like X. He had a gravelly voice just like X. He was bald just like X.
Bandanas, the whole, yeah.
Yeah. There are a lot of similarities, right? And X told this story on a Breakfast Club interview about how they were coming off stage, and some fans like, yo, you're great, man. To DMX, I love you. Like, but what's up with this guy who like sounds just like you? Like, and he was like, yeah, that's him right behind me. So he's like, yo, it's not me, it's the people, it's the streets, So they had their issues, and they had a little falling out, but eventually like squashed that beef. But he and Jay also had a long-standing rivalry, and they were competitive. I don't know that it ever was like a, ill will, but they were definitely competitive. It started in battles,
Yeah.
They had this legendary battle that happened in Harlem. I think they were battling on a pool table or something like that. And, it went round for round, and, X says that he won, of course. This is, before they were like, Canibus
94, I think.
Stuff.
Yeah.
Another time was, and this is like famous from the movie Backstage, which covered the Hard Knock Life tour. You got X and J battling, backstage, and it's a really dope. I think it was The Streets is Watching, if I remember the beat, but it was really dope. And they're going at it, and then this bodyguard comes in. I think he's Fruit of Islam, and I forget his name. But he starts rapping, and like arguably he got the better of both of them. It was a hilarious moment. We covered that on the site, but he and Jay battled many times over the years. And ultimately they weren't able to like get Murder Inc. But that was a huge, huge, huge what if.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool. I mean, D and Wah, the Dean family that staked X, they're different than other execs in the industry. I mean, these are as successful but low profile as you're going to find. I think it's only been in recent years through different documentaries and interviews that they've kind of stepped into the light. But with Jay, you had Dame Dash. With Ja, Ja became Irv's ultimate protege because he eventually signed him to his own company. So you had a lot of talking heads, especially with Dame, especially with Irv. And X kind of just moved as a unit, and those guys moved quietly. So I have to imagine the comeuppance around everyone, had to rub X the wrong way. And then, we'll talk about it later, but what ultimately happens when Jay-Z becomes the president of Def Jam had its own kind of plot line there.
Yeah, well, talk about that now. What happened there?
I mean, so, X delivers 5 #1 albums between 1998 and 2003, if I'm not mistaken. And 2003 is, you know, right after that time in 2004, after Grand Champ, Jay-Z becomes the president of Def Jam. Ultimate power move. And I remember, as I'm sure you do too, I think we were all kind of just like thrilled and like, what does this mean for the label to have an artist at the top? Because we were so used to, Russ and Rick, Russ, and then you had Kevin Liles and Leor Cohen at different points. So what did this mean? And what's interesting is you'll hear it from a lot of the folks that put Def Jam on their back, most notably LL Cool J, but you also hear it from Method Man and Redman, that it created a weird dynamic when this artist that becomes your teammate suddenly also becomes a teammate slash manager of the team. And, DMX was, I think, trying to figure out what happened next, wanted to maintain his value, but I think we can agree by the early 2000s that, the climate in rap had shifted. You suddenly had 50 Cent, you suddenly had ringtone rap, you had a lot of different things going on. And what is X, who's uncompromisingly himself, going to do? So it kind of comes to a head, and DMX ends up leaving Def Jam and he goes to Columbia Records, which Columbia was part of Rough House. It's a weird thing because that's where his career kind of started. You can say it, but not really. And for the first time in DMX's career, with an album called In the Year of the Dog Again, he doesn't go #1. He goes #2. And the messed up part, and I found this out in kind of preparing for this conversation, is the only album that outsold DMX that week was Now That's What I Call Music, volume number 22. Which crazy. That's not even fair. I mean, by today's standards, that would never happen. And X, those were compilations of hits already. X, and it kind of became an asterisk in the stat sheet. And what we found out last year, which I thought was really interesting, and I'm glad this came to the light before, this month's what's transpired with X passing, is DNY, the Ruff Ryders, went on the Breakfast Club in 2020, and they revealed something, that Jay-Z wiped a $12 million debt that DMX owed Def Jam. X, and we're not going to spend time talking about it here, but during the 2000s had been, in and out of legal trouble, had a lot of different debts he'd accrued. And we both know that label contracts coming out of the 90s and early 2000s were very much predatory. It was very easy for an artist, especially of that magnitude, to end up owing your record label a lot. And X even went on Drink Champs 2 different times and addressed this, of just like lavish gifts that he would receive from the label that he would later learn had come out of his own budget. So I think it's a really cool denouement to know that, just like Jay had done for so many other artists, he was behind the scenes, never put it out there, but was like, hey, I know this isn't what you want, but go without any debt. And I just think that's a really interesting point to make, that, and I don't believe that DMX passed away with any beefs. Over the years, there were different run-ins, Corrupt and Ja Rule and Jay-Z. And I think, from what I understand, all of those things were put to bed, which again speaks a lot to just how life works and the kind of man he was.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about DNY, and we touched on his artistic relationship with Swizz Beatz, briefly, but I think it's worth like kind of doing a deeper dive into that relationship, because over time it became something that was much more like a brotherhood than a friendship or a business partnership or anything like that. And earlier today, I saw Swizz Beatz. He kind of said his first verbal words. He's been posting on Instagram throughout the week, just like clips of X, pictures of X, 2 of them together, X, by himself. On the day that he passed, April 9th, he posted a clip of DMX singing Fame, I'm gonna live forever, baby, remember my name. And, with a bunch of doves, he said, you will never be forgotten. We will never let anyone forget your name, so this has clearly had a huge impact on him. Some of the things that he said in his testimonial today was that man suffered every day. From the day that I met him, he was suffering. He said, but he's not in pain anymore. He said the reason why he suffered is because he took on everyone else's pain, really an empath. He said that X would sit with homeless people and would eat with them. Had $30 million in the bank, but would be in an abandoned building eating with homeless people, just being sympathetic to that. And then he said that he was doing charity every day, just giving money away every day, and did more charity than any artist that he knew. But what do you know about that relationship between Swizz and DMX?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a true brotherhood there. And, X used, like I said a moment ago, used his biggest stage to uplift people. And I don't think there's a greater example of that than Swizz Beatz. And, Swizz has been involved, as far as I know, with every meaningful DMX project ever. And at times when X, was incarcerated or just not a public facing figure, nobody kept his value to hip hop and to the public as beautifully stated as Swizz Beatz. And I think, one of the great examples of that in recent years um, came in February of 2017, which is a precursor to Verzuz, when, Swizz and Just Blaze have this kind of impromptu DJ battle. And Swizz drops in on a joint that features DMX, Jay-Z, who else? Not Jadakiss, Nas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and you can go hear that today. And Swizz has since said it's worth it's gonna happen in time, it's gonna formally release. But I just feel like Swizz constantly fanned the flames for the public of keeping us excited, believing. I'm diehard DMX fans would agree with me. There was a period of time between 2006 and recent years where X put out stuff that wasn't finished, wasn't polished, wasn't ready. I'm sure a lot of that was, his many financial obligations and things like that. But Swizz always kept the beacon going, and I believe it. And I think we will find in time that X's great days were ahead of him, and that this is going to be one of hip hop's great comeback stories. And I believe, I hope to my heart, and you and I have spoken about it recently on this podcast, that music is in the can and that we'll get to hear it.
Yeah, we're going to definitely talk about that. One of the things that I saw over the years is that Swizz Beatz was his biggest champion, and it wasn't, he was obviously excited about the music. There are like at least 7 or 8 interviews over, like, I'd say a 3 or 4 year period where he's championing the music, like what the album is going to sound like, how excited he is to share it with people. But he also championed X's sobriety. Whenever X would, come back clean and sober, he always highlighted that. And you could see it was positive reinforcement. He was rooting for him to succeed, not just as an artist, but as a person, and so I can't imagine, what this has been like for him, so we talked about Get At Me Dog and Ruff Ryders Anthem, but there's so many songs in DMX's discography. What are some other ones that stick out to you?
I'll be the first one to admit it was never my favorite, but I've talked to so many people over the last week who love the joint Damien, which is, one of those songs that X came through with. And I bring it up because it means a lot to people, but I also think it's one of those things when we talk about beatboxing that speaks to X's love of hip hop and rapping. It's a storytelling joint, and it's a conversation with the devil. And it wasn't just a concept to X. It was a really personal thing from all that I've read. Like Dane Grease has talked about it, that X would often talk about battling his demons. And and I think we all can understand that. But to put it to words like that, it's very much in the canon of Slick Rick to me. And whereas you had like Snoop Dogg with Murder Was the Case kind of do the classic, Mephistopheles deal with the devil, I think it was Daz that versus the devil. With X, he does both voices, which reminds me a lot of like what we would see later with Kendrick Lamar, or even like a Devin the Dude. Like, you have artists that do that, and I think that's really important. So that's one from the early album, but I think we got to talk about Slippin'.
Yeah, for me, there are many. Like I made a playlist just yesterday, and I think it's got 22 songs, and I haven't even added like the Murder Inc. collabs and stuff like that. So it's probably going to run out of 25, 30, something like that. Um, but, I think some of my favorites were, and two of them were songs that like I don't know if he could even get away with, today, just because I listened to the lyrics and I'm like, whoa, maybe he could get away with it in a Dave Chappelle kind of way, and that like he's just speaking his truth and he doesn't care,
Yeah.
it's his truth. But one is What These Bees Want, with Cisco, which is such a like interesting song because it's really simple with just a couple of notes in it, real hard beat, but you wouldn't. X is so hard and rough that you wouldn't think of him like having a successful song with Cisco, right? Who was like the Thong song and like Gloss and and Glare and but it works so well, it just it's gritty, it's hard, and it is I think just one of his best songs. And another one is Where the Hood At,
Mm.
which is, on the Grand Champ, his last Def Jam album. And that, if you listen to that first verse, it's like, wow, he would get canceled over it now. But like,
Yeah.
it's such a hard song. Like you put it on, you just want to like, riot. It's incredible. But the one you mentioned is the first song that I listened to. When the news came that he'd had the heart attack,
Hmm.
because was slipping, it was just such a vulnerable song talking about his imperfections and the struggle that he faced. That song I think will always be my personal favorite of his.
It's been wild. I mean, the last I got back to Philly on Monday, and I live on a kind of a thoroughfare of a street, and there's so many cars that have been passing, blasting the music of DMX, even before Friday, just over the week, like conjuring, you know, good, good message out there, and celebrating a life and a talent. And I hear slipping a lot, and it's wild. You called me yesterday, and I was in West Philly, and there was a guy in front of me on a motor scooter, which is interesting because I don't think anybody made the motorcycle, the dirt bike, all of that is hip hop, is Ruff Ryders, and he had a boombox on the back just blasting, slipping, to the point where it was scratching. It was on volume 10, and even still, like, I turned my radio off just to kind of take in the moment. And that song is it's I think it's X's magnum opus of songs. Also, I think that Who We Be is important to mention. That was later on, and again, that was on the Great Depression album. Here we are into Y2K. New stars are emerging. The South is really kind of taking up a lot of the real estate, and X comes with a song that to me feels like, pounding yourself in the chest and riling yourself up before a game, or like a military chant. And again, he used a producer, Black Key, that people didn't know, that wasn't a household name. And at this point, X has a huge budget, he can be grabbing anyone he wants. But he did it, and it was a Grammy nominated joint. But it was just classic X. Other thing I want to talk about that I think is interesting, that kind of dawns on me, is there's a weird connection with X and EPMD. And I talked about the K Solo thing, but X at three different points in his career raps over beats that pay homage to EPMD and the Hit Squad. And I always thought that was so interesting. And it's sad to me, because Eric Sermon and EPMD were, some of those artists that helped make Def Jam what it became, in the late 80s and early 90s, that we only got 4-3-2-1. But, from Get At Me Dog to the Ruff Ryders Posse cut on the first group album, which those were great projects too, they were using the same samples that Eric and Parrish used. And I always thought that was cool. And then probably as a little slight to K Solo, he used the same sample as Rockin' from My Hometown on Fucking with D. And again, that's the type of joint that could never make radio. But I know for me, like in my friends at the time, we knew every word of that song. Like X did songs that just slapped in the face of the mainstream, and made you feel them. And I think that that was such a powerful thing that only the top rappers can ever do.
Absolutely. And you talk about turning down your music so you could experience it, from someone else's perspective. That happened to me too, man. Like, I went by the hospital twice.
Hmm.
The Saturday after the heart attack, was heavy, because like, the reports were coming out, and even though we all were hopeful, it made it seem like his passing was going to be inevitable, and so I drove by the hospital that day. I was over by the mall anyway, and it was only like a couple minutes from there. So I wanted to just go by. I threw him a prayer. I was playing his music, and I wanted to see what the energy was like. And surprisingly, there was no one out. At that point, it was pretty quiet. But then the family announced on Tuesday, that they were going to do a vigil at 5 o'clock, and they wanted people to come out. And so I came by again. I didn't get there till like 6:15, 6:30, but it was like part vigil, and part celebration. People walking the streets wearing X, paraphernalia, throwing up their X's. You had music, coming from every direction. The cops were there, but it was peaceful. They were just like directing traffic and things like that. It was a real experience, and there were hundreds of people out there just celebrating the man. But I did the same thing. I turned down my music and I just rolled down my windows and just like experienced like the environment. Just wanted to kind of soak it in, and again sent him prayers while I was there. So we talked about the music. He had some incredible success, like unprecedented success. 5 straight #1 albums. 2 in that one year to begin his career. Uh, Surprisingly, no Grammys. Only one award. Only one significant award. It was a American Music Award, which is
Hmm.
fan based. But what does it say about the culture to you that not only that you can have that much commercial success and not receive the kind of critical acclaim that you would think would accompany it?
It's a travesty, but it's not surprising. And I think you did a really good job on a recent podcast of breaking down the way the Grammys have evolved. And, you know, at the time between 98 and 2005, 2006, the Grammys weren't ready to give somebody like DMX his props. And I think they are now. Um, but I think it comes back to that, a statue is not a representation of how nice DMX is. And I think that, sort of like Big Daddy Kane or, I think that's a really, really good example. X at his best was performing, to me, to appreciate this guy. And we're going to talk about a couple of key performances in a second. But how hip hop is that nothing you can do on a commercial side can ever measure up to what you mean standing in front of people, whether it was a club show or it was Woodstock 99. And I love that, because that's the way I feel about, Kane and Melly Mel and Grandmaster Caz and, hip hop's forefathers and mothers. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, in addition to the music, he was a star, in every sense of the word, and that translated to film too. He was in a few films. Last Hour, which I must confess I did not see, but Cradle to the Grave, Belly, and I know that I'm probably gonna get some like blowback for this, but the film that I liked more than Belly that he was in was Romeo Must Die.
hmm.
I think it was Jet Li, Aaliyah was in it, and apparently Aaliyah got him into the movie. He thought that she might be standoffish. Was maybe a little bit intimidated, but like she was like really welcoming to him, like embraced him. I think physically and also figuratively, and really, he spoke glowingly about how warm she was. So
I love
uh,
that story. I
yeah,
just, and
yeah,
X had talked about it too. And I think it's really cool because, they ended up X. I love the way he worded it too. The only time I ever had a date to something that wasn't my wife was Aaliyah, and I forget the award shows like Soul Train or might have been the VMAs.
Yeah.
But X went out and rented a Rolls Royce. They were in LA, and it wasn't because he was trying to do something. He was just, I think, he said as much. Like I was proud to be in the company of a beautiful woman, but I wanted to just celebrate that moment. And I think it's really cool to hear how Aaliyah embraced him. I mean, we've heard stories of like Janet and Pac on Poetic Justice, whether true or not, but that I think X was apprehensive, and to find out that she welcomed him, but also to see that this guy is a superstar and can have a platonic friendship, but still treat her as a lady in a public stage is just really cool. And yeah, I need to go back and rewatch that one.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the legendary moments of DMX. This guy, people talk about living legend and bigger than life all the time, but there are so many things that this guy did that just show it. Like I said, we got to experience it in person. Like you saw it firsthand, the entourage. I had experienced it, a couple of times. But there's so many moments. One of my favorites is there was a conversation, it was an interview that Toure had. And he's sitting at a table with Big Pun, John Forte, Mike Geronimo, Mos Def, Canibus, and DMX. And, first of all, like just to be in the presence of that many great MCs is incredible. But he held an interview, and this is on the site. We got the full conversation. He has a conversation with them, does an interview. And at the end, they just start an impromptu cypher, and every MC there is a competitor, and they're coming with their best verses, and we saw later on that some of these verses would end up on records and things like that. But just seeing that competition and seeing X hold down the table like that was amazing. But what did you think about that? And
Yeah, and I think I'm pretty sure you mentioned Big Pun, who was there too. I mean, just a crazy moment. And what's wild, something I learned, and I wasn't, I didn't grow up in New York, but that there was a tape that circulated, right around '98 that was a mixtape. I forget who was behind it, but it was one side A was DMX and side B was Canibus. And I mean, it's cool that they appeared on 4-3-2-1. I know for Canibus that wasn't the best circumstances, but to have this moment too, which I think is much more friendly to both of them, to have these two artists that had all the streets talking in very different ways, it's just really cool. And then you had Pun there, and Mos Def, and X is holding court at the table. I mean, just smoking his cigarettes and talking his shit, and that moment will live in infamy. And I'm so glad for venues like AFH, and Talib brings it up. He's brought it up with John Forte. He brought it up with DMX in their conversation. It'll live forever. I think that's a great example. A year later, and it's something again that I realized only kind of in retrospect, was Woodstock '99. You were not at Woodstock '99, were you?
No, I was not.
Okay.
I was not. Yeah.
Probably for the best. But that was the third Woodstock, and it kind of lives in infamy because that was where the fires happened, and there wasn't enough water, and just bad things. But DMX, he spoke about it as one of the highlights of his career. 200,000 people. That's the estimate. There could have very well been more, but X just tore it down. And you and I spoke about it a little bit, but X's shows were not filled with people on stage. It was him. He never had a hype man. He said the only time he ever had a hype man in his career was one time with Ja Rule, and I think it was for a video appearance. But otherwise, it was just him and a DJ, or a live band, and he tore it down. And I realized that he does this thing with the crowd, this like call and response chant, and I think it's a testament to how smart DMX was. I didn't realize it until people on Twitter put it up, but it was an exact replication of what Freddie Mercury from Queen had done during Live Aid in 1985, of all things, of that like ayo, 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 and then people bring it back. And to watch that, I don't know if you're going to find a more emblematic moment of Woodstock /99 than that. And I think that just shows what a prime performer he was.
Yeah, and he was such a personality that he could make a platform. He was on Drink Champs not too long ago, actually earlier this year. I think it was January or February, so it's probably recorded like sometime pretty close to that. But they brought him back on for the second time because they were very forthright in saying that his appearance on what I believe was episode 3 of the
Hmm.
podcast is the thing that actually, like, put them on the map. It was their fire in the stadium moment. It was like the Ray J moment for the Breakfast Club was DMX being on that. He often he prayed on that episode. He prayed on a Breakfast Club episode. He often like had the prayer, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But just that kind of appearance could, like, shift like the success of something overnight. You talk about the Woodstock tour. Literally last night, I met this guy who used to do tours, and you talked about in a recent episode of our podcast about 2000, the Cash Money Rough Riders tour, and the significance of that, and like the juxtaposition between those two collectives, which had such different sounds and represented very different regions. Well, this guy, it turns out, actually was working on that tour, and he lived in New York. The last show was in Nassau Coliseum out in Long Island, and his sister had never been to a concert, so he was going to make that her first show. X heard him say that his sister's first show was going to be that night, and he said, "Oh, okay, well, we're going to do this right." So he got a limousine, sent the limousine to pick the girl up, brought her there, had her backstage, eating with all the Rough Riders, like, and like, every Eve, and like, all these people are coming up, giving her hugs, welcoming them to the show. Um, you know, he gets on stage, she's front row. He like takes his bandana off his head, gives her the bandana like right there on stage, and then afterwards, like, greets her, gives her a hug, says, "Don't worry, we'll get your brother home soon." But that's just the kind of guy that the dude was. Just, just like little acts of kindness like that, just completely like unnecessary, unsolicited, just random acts of kindness. And based on what Swizz Beatz says, that's like just a firsthand glimpse of like, the kind of thing that he did on the daily. But I think the biggest platform where we saw him shine was last year, in the midst of the pandemic and lockdown, with Verzuz being one of the best things to come out of that. His Verzuz with Snoop remains one of my favorites. It was the two dogs, getting at each other and giving each other their flowers. But what was that experience like for you? I know we broke it down like in our podcast too.
We did. I mean, in retrospect, I think it was a great performance. Very interesting matchings. I know there's like, and you and I talked about it at the time. I was a little bit like, well, Snoop, came in a little bit earlier and had success, and we always like those perfectly symmetric verses. But I think it was one of the great ones. And what I'm really happy about is that, you said it, for the last 3 or 4 years, Swizz and X had been talking about what was going to happen, kind of this comeback. And we got a little bit of a glimpse of it with Bout Shit last year, his feature on the Locks album, which was on the playlist, and you were a big fan of. But I'm glad that in real time, in a year where he couldn't perform, that X got to feel the love with Verzuz on this new technology that his protege, and those are my words, but that Swizz has helped give to the world, that X gets this just true celebration of love. And I don't think that is one. I think that's one sort of like Erica and Jill, where unanimously we can say they both won. And it was interesting because on Drink Champs, X was really insightful, and he said he loves Verzuz, thrilled to have done it. But the only thing, and I think Nori pressed the issue, I think it was Nori, it might have been Talib. Only thing he didn't like about it is that there had to be a winner when we're all winners. And I thought that was just such like a DMX truism of like, yo, if this is really about just, celebrating artists in an innovative way, are we screwing ourselves up by like, trying to come in with takes and, just a cool moment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the moments that sticks out the most is one that has recurred with him throughout his career. And that's just like his spiritual side, his like, wearing his faith on his sleeve, you know, not ever hiding it. You know, he prayed often. He prayed daily. He said, you know, the first thing he would do when he woke was to pray. He prayed before every show and
Mm.
after every show. He prayed in interviews, and you know, he clearly prayed on albums too. You know, prayers were a staple on his albums. He was a deacon. Was, you know, flirted with being a pastor. Said that a number of times. You know, in an interview he did with the Breakfast Club back in 2016, I believe, he said his heart had stopped for 4 minutes. You know, which is crazy when we think about like how he ultimately passed away. But his heart stopped for 4 minutes in 2016. He said it was an asthma attack. The media reported it as an OD, but he said it caused him to live life more intentionally. And
Mm.
one of the things that he realized is, you know, is that he has no regrets in life because everything happens the way it's supposed to happen. God don't make mistakes, or something he said. And there's some quotes that he had there that I thought were just worth kind of pulling out because they're just so like profound and speak to who he was as a man. And one was, we won't know what God is going to do for us until we're in a situation where only God can do it for us. He said, God won't walk you to what he won't walk you through. He said, God is the only one who can have a bad situation become a beautiful situation without ever changing the situation. And then he said, the story has already been written. It speaks on before we were born, and it refers to after we're gone. So if he is already written, if it has already been written, what makes us think we can change any aspect of the story? You know, and so these are all statements that really talk to his belief that, you know, God has a plan, and the way that it works out is, you know, what that plan is, and it's what it's meant to be. And then the last one I wrote down was, God's strongest warriors are those most afflicted. If you're not a threat to the devil, he ain't gonna waste his time on messing your life up. And so, you know, he I think, you know, he was very aware of his mortality, but not afraid of it because, you know, he knew that it was all part of the plan. And I think that it just gives us perspective as we continue to process what's happened with him, you know, and know that he's like in a better place, you know. I think one of the things that gives us solace is that there is more music to come. This is definitely not the last thing we've ever heard of DMX. You know, he on that Drink Champs was talking about his album, and Swizz, you know, we talked about, has been campaigning about it for years now, talking about what's happening. But this is the first time I can remember DMX opening up. And the last couple times is Talib Kweli and with Drink Champs. But you talked about the collaboration with Nas, Jadakiss, and Jay Z. The new album is going to have supposedly Griselda, Pop Smoke, Snoop is going to be on the album, Usher, The Locks, Alicia Keys, Nas, Bono, Scarface, Lil Wayne. You know, he was detailed about its recording process. He started recording in Nashville initially, and you know, he was having trouble like getting creative collaborations because nobody was coming to Nashville. So someone said, you need to come out to LA. So he went to LA and started recording on Snoop's compound. He said, like, you can't go outside in LA and not trip over a star. And so like that just opened up the floodgates for him. And supposedly Dre is gonna do 2 tracks. I've heard that Kanye's got some tracks. Like, so I think that that album is going to come and it's going to be absolutely, absolutely phenomenal when it does, you know, and it's going to be a proper send off for a man who's meant so much for hip hop, you know. But I know you had a few last thoughts that you wanted to share.
Yeah, no, I look at that, and the two thoughts I have on DMX are, you know, a song that you and I both hold in the highest regard is The Message, you know, by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. And I look at lyrics like, don't push me, I'm close to the edge, I'm trying not to lose my head. Like, to me, that is, if you were to explain what is hip hop at its best, it's that lyric. And, you know, 15 years, give or take, after that song came out, I think DMX lived that. He lived that in his triumphs. He lived that in his trials. I think that, you know, hip hop is designed to be the voice of the struggle, the voice of the people. And you don't hear X's name. I think that'll change after this year. You don't hear X's name come up a lot when it comes to top fives. But I think that when you really look at what makes rap timeless and impactful, DMX embodies all of that. And you know, one of the things that I look at as a storyteller is, you know, the arc of a hero. You know, you go from orphan to wanderer to warrior to martyr. And for all the things that we've just talked about that have, you know, followed DMX with his life, for better and worse, I think we get that. And, you know, that's why we look so highly to Tupac and to Biggie and to, you know, so many of our heroes. And I think that DMX's life follows a hero's journey. And you know, I certainly wish that he was here, but I think that, you know, he will be here forever because of that.
Absolutely. You know, I think about what Swizz Beatz said in his testimonial. He said that that man struggled every day. And, you know, I guess for me, my last thought is just thinking about his song Slipping, because the first words that DMX says are, to live is to struggle, to survive is to find meaning in the struggle. That to me sums up, you know, DMX. He's a person who struggled, who suffered tremendously, but he always sought to find meaning in that and share that wisdom with other people, help to enrich their lives, live his life purposefully and through faith. And, you know, I believe that he would believe that this was part of the plan. And this is one of those situations where it's painful, but the same situation is going to bring beautiful things in the future, like he said. So, you know, I celebrate him. I'm glad we were able to celebrate him together. I'm glad we still have the platform to do that, you know, and I hope that this brings some comfort to other people, you know. So we're at that time. What's your song of the week?
Man, I like what you just said. I'm gonna make it Slipping.
Yeah, slipping for me too, man. Yeah, yeah. Word. Peace, man.
All right, man. Until next time.
All right.